Hi guys, my name is Ben Guilford. I'm the owner of the Firebrick Company, and in this video we're going to show you how to set up and lay the vent arch bricks that make up the front of your precast oven kit.
Now we're ready to lay the vent arch bricks. So to do that we need our formwork, we're going to need a pencil, obviously we're going to need the bricks that make up the vent arch at the front here, and you'll want to have your dead blow mallet as well. We'll be mixing up a small batch of that refractory mortar. So first thing is we get our formwork and put it in. We're going to be setting it up like this later on, which sort of makes sense because that's where we'll be building the arch around. But we'll start with putting it in flat, and we line it up with this angled section here on either side. So we get it to line up on those. You just get a pencil and just draw a line on each side, and that's going to be where our bricks are going to sit. Then we can get our bricks that make up the columns on the left and right. You'll see they have a point, and the idea of those is they actually match this indentation here that we've created in the casting. The concept behind that idea of the design is so that these columns sort of tie into the casting, they lock into it. They're not just stuck to it with a bit of the mortar, no, they're actually locked into it. So it just makes this brickwork incredibly strong. Now, when we set these up, you'll find that you can set them up however you like. I'll sort of give you a bit of freedom around that, it's really up to you. What I like to do is, where possible, I have these bricks line up with the front of the floor tiles, okay? That actually gives us a neat little gap of about 5 millimeters on this side, and it looks like about 10 millimeters on this face. And I can fill that in with the refractory mortar. If you wanted to, you could push it back in, okay, and aim for a tighter joint here, but it doesn't really add any value pushing it back. It's not going to make it a better oven or anything. So I think it's just nice having these bricks lining up with the front edge. Okay, now you'll notice there's about 30 mil of floor tile on either side. That's all part of the design, so keep a nice neat finish. And yeah, we basically just need to mix up our mortar now. We're also going to want to have a level. We're going to use that level just so that we make sure we're keeping these bricks sort of flat as we go up, but you'll see that as I lay them. So before we lay the bricks that make up the vent arch, we want to make sure we've soaked them thoroughly in water so that we get really good bond between the bricks and the mortar. And we also want to make sure that we have cleaned up the surfaces that we're going to be laying onto. So just get a scourer, some water, and just give the casting a scrub, particularly in this area, just to remove any loose material. Maybe there's some dust on it. We just want to make sure that we're getting a really good bond with that surface. The same thing with the tiles here. Once they're clean, then you want to make sure you get them soaked. So for the brick floor, you can pour some water onto that and let that soak in to those tiles. For the casting itself, we just wipe it down with a really nice wet cloth several times to get some water into that surface so that it bonds well with the mortar. The question that we get from time to time is, how wet should the bricks be? Should I lay them straight out of the water, you know, take them out of the tub and put the mortar straight on it? You don't need to do that. The bricks will actually, once they're soaked in water, they hold the water for quite a long time. So if you're in a climate that's not, you know, it's not red hot, it's not 30 degrees plus, then you could pull the bricks out of the water half an hour ahead of time and lay them, and they won't have dried out to a point that it'd be a problem. But usually I say, hey, take them out of the water about 10 minutes before you need them, and then lay them. When you're putting mortar on your bricks, we're aiming to lay a joint that's only about 3 millimeters thick. It's a very thin joint. So I don't want to put heaps and heaps of mortar on the brick. I want to actually put on about the 3 millimeters, thereabouts, so that I don't have to tap it down too hard to sort of squeeze mortar out of it. So basically butter the brick with mortar. Again, you're aiming for about that 3mm. Just make sure there's no lumps in it, like that. So that's roughly 3mm. And then when I tap that down, I'm going to be able to get it down to the height that I'm after. And we're actually going to see that with the lines on the formwork. I'm also going to put a bit of mortar on these faces so that it bonds in here. So what I like to do is actually use a dead blow mallet and my eyeballs and actually compare the joint thickness. So that's what it's actually handy maybe to have a wet sponge around, so you can just wipe down the face of the brick and just see if the joint is thicker on one side than the other, and then you know maybe it's tilted. The other thing you can do is you can actually look at the edge of the brick and see, is it lining up with the face of the formwork? And in this case, it is. And maybe I could just bring that edge down a little bit. And from front to back, I can do the same thing where I look at this joint and see, is it thicker at the back than it is at the front? If it is, I'll tap it down at the back. All right, now the beauty of this mortar mix is I actually have a little bit of time to play around. It takes about 2 or 3 minutes for this mortar to actually start to firm up. And so for the next 3 minutes, I can wiggle this thing around to my heart's content until I've got it in the right position. So I'm going to get the other side in, and then I'm going to put my level across the top and use that to help me figure out, all right, do I have the bricks sort of lined up with each other? Are they flush? And I'm not looking at the bubbles so much as just looking at the underside of the level and seeing, is it sitting flush on both sides? So the other thing just to be aware of, just a little tip, is when you're placing these bricks, you'll have a tendency of shifting the formwork across. Just for the first two, it's actually really easy when you're tapping and doing stuff. You might move the formwork left or right. And so just check that it is still lined up where you had it before. And you can just tap it across. If you've moved it to the left, well, tap it back to the right, because we have those few minutes to work with while the bricks are still sort of elastic. That mortar's still got some movement in it, so we can still make adjustments. After it's sort of set, it's bonded and it's not really wiggling around anymore, ideally we don't want to be trying to knock it around, because then it tends to want to break the bond that we've created with that mortar. You'll notice here as well, the eagle eyes out there will be saying, oh, you've missed some mortar under that brick. And I have, so this corner I was a little bit light on with the trowel, but I can just parge that in with the trowel. I can just force some mortar into that joint and fill it up now. So we've got the first 2 bricks in, and now we're ready to start laying the rest. This is where we want to set up the formwork so that it's sitting upright rather than laying down. We've given you these plastic strips in the kit, and the purpose of these is just to raise the formwork by about 3mm, so that once you've laid the arch and you've finished everything, you can pull these strips out from underneath the formwork and it'll drop by about 3mm and then it'll come out. Whereas if we didn't have something like this, well then your formwork's really stuck in there. Okay, now just a tip, when we cut these, sometimes there's a little burr on the edge, so if you just rub it on your floor tile, acts as a nice bit of sandpaper, you can knock any burrs off the edge so that when you pull the formwork out, you won't grab it. Okay, so you put your strips on and you want them just hanging out the front a little bit so that you've got something to grab later on. Get your formwork and we'll just gently slot it in between the bricks here. Line it up, putting it in here. We're going to line it up with the front face of these bricks. Okay, and now we can use our markers here to line up our brickwork. And to set the height of our brick joints. Another thing that I want to mention at this point is that fire bricks, when they're made with tolerances, plus or minus 1.5mm. So you may find that one brick in your kit is a little smaller, maybe one's a little bigger. And that is unfortunately just the nature of the beast. It's just how they're made. They're fired in a kiln at 1300 degrees for 4 days. And so some bricks in a kiln may experience slightly higher temperatures. Some might be compressed a little bit because they're at the bottom of the stack. And so we do get very small variance in the thickness of the bricks. And so you may find, like I have here, that this brick on this side is sitting a little higher than this one is on the left. And that's really not the end of the world. We can just make that up with the mortar joints as we go up. So I can make the mortar joint on the left here just a little bit thicker for the next one so that I end up matching. The other thing that you can do is get your bricks and compare them and pair them up. So you go through the bricks for that make up these arches and find matching pairs of thicknesses. So if you do have, maybe you have a couple that are a tiny bit smaller, well, put those together and put them on the same row, if you will, or same level, so that you're dealing with the same joint thickness. But in the end, it's not the end of the world. You're gonna see later on when I clean all this up, my mortar joints are gonna vary a little bit. I'm not an expert bricklayer, I'm an engineer. And we're building, effectively, we're building a brick oven, and they're gonna be a little bit rustic. And it's not the end of the world if your mortar joints aren't like micromillimeter perfect. It doesn't really matter. The food will taste the same. So don't stress too hard. This is meant to be an enjoyable project, not something that becomes a big headache for you. But just be aware of that. There is some variability in the thickness of the bricks, and so you may find you will have to vary your gaps a little bit from this marker here is a guide. You don't have to make them exactly that thick. This is just to give you a guide so that you keep your levels as you go up. So you saw me before buttering up the brick, and I really do recommend when you're laying each one, rather than buttering the top of this brick, you butter the bottom of the brick you're about to lay. You can also then put some mortar on the end of the brick that's gonna end up in here, or if you prefer, you can actually just trowel some of the mortar into this joint and push the brick into that. And that's actually a tiny bit easier. So just to demonstrate, it's not that there's one right way of doing this. Some ways are easier than others. This way is probably a tiny bit easier than buttering the end of the brick. But just so you know, it's one of those projects where there's it's meant to be good fun. It's not meant to be like, oh, you have to do it this particular way. You can take your formwork out if you need to clean off any mortar that's sort of bled through the inside face. Don't worry about it. You can pull the formwork out, just scrape that off, and then put the formwork back in, and it should be sitting exactly where it was before. So before you lay the vent arch, we want to do a couple of things. Firstly, we want to just give these columns give them about 15 minutes or so just to take their initial set so they're not moving around on you. The other thing that I really want you to do is I want you to check that your formwork, this corner, the top corner of your formwork, should actually line up with the top corner of this Springer brick. Now, the reason we need to make sure that those two corners line up is, let's say, for example, you managed to lay your bricks and somehow you've gone a little bit high, and the corner of the brick is actually above the corner of the formwork. When you lay your vent arch, you'll find that the bricks won't quite fit. The joints will be really, really tight at best, and that's because the column's sort of getting, the vent is getting pushed together. That arch is getting sort of dropped down, and they're all falling into each other. So what we want to do is we can actually raise the bottom of this formwork to match that. So if you have gone a little bit high, don't worry, it's not the end of the world. Just put some packers under your formwork to raise it up so that those two corners line up. So once we've got the formwork all set in its correct position, so we want it to be flush with this front edge, because we want to use this front edge of the formwork to lay the vent arch bricks to give us that nice straight line that we're after. Once we've got that in position, we want to dry fit the arch bricks to make sure, firstly, that they're going to fit nicely, but also so that we can figure out what kind of gap we can allow between each brick. so that when we're putting the mortar on, we know how tight we need to lay the bricks so that we don't run out of room when we get to the middle. So we've done our dry fit here, and we can see that with the bricks touching at the bottom, so that the bricks don't touch all the way up, it's only at the bottom edge that they actually contact each other. And so that's the important spot to think about. When we think about our mortar joint, we really want to think about this gap here, all right? And then we get into a wedge, which is much easier to manage. In the middle here, we've got a gap. Now your gap will probably be different. Maybe yours is a little smaller, maybe it's a tiny bit bigger. Again, there's a variance in the physical dimensions of these bricks. And so you may find that your gap is a little bigger than this one or a little smaller, but we can manage that with the thickness of the mortar joints. So I've got about a 6 or 7 mil joint here, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 joints over which I can make that up. Now, I could lay them brick on this bottom edge. And the way to do that is basically when you butter the brick, you don't put any mortar on the very bottom edge. You effectively just wipe that off so that we've just got mortar down to, for 95% of that surface. And then I'll be left with a little sort of V of mortar here, which is fine. Or I can deliberately put a small amount of mortar at that bottom joint and to bring all of this together. Okay, now to be honest, what I'd recommend you do is aim for basically brick on brick joints at the bottom, because you will get a little bit of mortar in between them anyway, and you will find that it'll close up that gap in the middle naturally. So what you may actually find when you go to lay the last brick, that it doesn't fit. That you've managed to put a little bit of extra mortar in between each one, and you go to put that last brick in and it doesn't quite make it. Don't panic, it's not the end of the world. At that point you just need to get out your angle grinder and that masonry grinding disc and just grind down one face of the brick so that you can get it in there. Okay, so again, safety glasses, gloves, dust mask, the usual. Right? So don't panic if you do get to that point, you're like, oh, my last brick doesn't quite make it. Don't worry too much. Another thing I will take the opportunity to point out now is that there are numbers on the tops of these bricks, and please face the numbers towards you, so you should be reading them left to right. The reason we put numbers on the bricks is we actually hand pick these bricks. We're very sort of fussy about these ones because these are really right on show. And we hand pick them and we pick the best face of the brick and we set them up and paint them so that the best face is facing forwards. These are fire bricks, fairly industrial material, and so as such they're not made like a porcelain tile with like incredibly refined edges. So we're quite fussy about the ones that we choose to put in the kits, so you get a nice neat finish on the front. But you will find that you may have a couple of little chips here and there, and that's all just part of the aesthetic at the end of the day. A few tips for doing this: make sure all bricks about to be laid are soaked in water and wet down the surface of the bricks where the arch starts and finishes. You also want the center of this brick to be resting on the formwork. If I exaggerate and we have, this edge is resting on the formwork, well then we're going to get a really stepped arch. We want, a nice smooth arch if we can get it. So that's what you're looking for, is having the center of the brick resting on the formwork. And my technique is usually just to rub. So I wiggle the brick left to right, and that gives me a bit of movement, and it ensures that I'm getting a bond with the brick behind it. Now the other thing I will say is that you can see I haven't filled this joint completely. Maybe I could have put a little bit more mortar on there, but it doesn't matter because I can fill it now. Just get a little bit on my finger and just force it into that joint. By the way, this job is one of the jobs that you really need. Once you start it, you need to finish it. So we can't lay this half of the arch and then wander away and come back hit it tomorrow. We really need to finish it so that the whole arch sets together and all bonds. The issue, if I come back and maybe do this half tomorrow, you see I'm doing a lot of wiggling, I'm doing some tapping, and there's a risk that I'll bump the formwork and break the bond between the springer and the arch. So once you start, this is one that you really need to finish. Our arch is laid. Now we want to take the opportunity to give it a clean while we have the chance. The best way to do it is scrape off any excess with a trowel. So we can just come along and just take off the excess using your trowel. Then you can come over, you can use a scourer if you want. I use the blue scourers because they don't tend to leave any residue behind. The green, your standard green scourers from the supermarket tend to leave a bit of green behind for some reason, but the non-scratch blue ones work really well. And we just give it a little scrub and then sponge that off, and we'll have a nice clean surface. Now once all these mortar joints are set, we can come back and give it a really good scrub and hit it with lots of fresh water. So using a sponge and fresh water and then drying it off with a towel, and that will really help remove the, you get this haze on the surface, which is just a result of sort of smearing mortar around on the surface. It'll leave a little light haze, sort of this dusty look to it, which is not the end of the world. But you can remove that. If you use plenty of fresh water, you can get a little bit of it out. You always end up with a bit of haze, but if we give it a really good scrub, we can get some of that haze out.